All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca DeLaCruz, and this is my senior honors thesis presentation on my topic, which is titled Como que bilingüe, the influence of home language on maize use in Spanish-English bilingual college students in Orange County. This project is being completed in partial fulfillment of the requirements to graduate with university honors. And I would also like to take a moment to thank my mentor, Dr. Rahul Chakraborty, for his support throughout the completion of this project. So when I'm talking about mazes, I'm not talking about like the cornfields that you go through during Halloween. I'm talking about the linguistic mazes, which according to Walter Lobin, are non-disordered disfluencies which are found in the natural flow of speech. So this can include filled pauses, such as It can also include revisions, such as that. It could also include repetitions, such as that. And it can also include connectors, such as, and like this happened. So historically, originally, mazes were considered to be a clinical indicator of an underlying language disorder or a potential stuttering problem. So later studies debunked this theory, as they found that children and adults with normally developing language also produce mazes. Today, mazes are understood as a manifestation of an underlying subsystem of cognitive and linguistic demands, such as working through language-specific tasks and simultaneous self-monitoring and covert repair. Because of their unique nature, mazes offer a unique avenue for language researchers to gain insight into a speaker's underlying language system and neurophysiological processes. So a particular area of interest for me is, okay, how does this equate, or how does this factor in among bilinguals? So previous studies done by Ribault, Hoff, and Valles have found that just naturally, bilinguals produce more mazes, or again, normal disfluencies, than their monolingual counterparts. This is because bilingual speakers are more likely to produce expressive errors in their less dominant language, which makes sense, right? If you use a language less frequently, you're going to be more likely to make more errors in it. But I want to stop here and go back a little bit. So if ever since 1976, mazes were considered to be a clinical indicator of an underlying language disorder, and it wasn't until this century that it was discovered that bilinguals just by nature produce more mazes, not because of disorder or anything, but just due to the nature of them being bilingual. Then just think of the time in between how many bilinguals have been misdiagnosed as having a language disorder, when in reality, it was just due to a language difference due to the nature of their bilingualism. Pretty dismal statistic. So in terms of previous maze studies done in bilinguals, the majority of the studies have focused on bilingual children. Not many have been done in adults. Additionally, when we're talking about bilingualism, it's important to consider just how diverse bilingualism is. For example, the bilingual experience of someone who uses each language 50% of the time is going to look a lot different than someone who is exposed to one language 80% of the time, and they use the other one only 20% of the time. So a pretty good way to measure or capture the frequency in which bilingual uses their two languages is their home language. Because if you use a language at home, that means that you use it at least somewhat frequently, somewhat consistently, with a pretty consistent group of people. However, there are currently no published studies, at least that I could encounter in my literature review, that explore the role of an adult bilingual speaker's home language on their maze use. So that's what I did. The goal of my study is to examine whether a Spanish-English bilingual adult's home language influences their English L2 production as indexed by maze. So just to recap, L1 stands for first language, the one that you learn first, and L2 stands for second language, the one that you acquire second. So in the case of this study, all of the participants, L1 Spanish, and their L2 is English. So the way that I go about this study is looking at two different groups. So there's one group who reportedly only uses Spanish at home, and another group who uses both Spanish and English at home. My hypothesis is that those who use both Spanish and English at home will produce fewer mazes in their L2 or English. And this is because they have more exposure using English in a variety of settings, including in their home. Also important to note is that in this particular demographic that we're looking at in Orange County, the dominant language is largely English, especially among college students. So it's the probability of them using English is much in a variety of settings, not just at home, but also like at work, at school, is much higher. And the other piece of my hypothesis is that those who use only Spanish at home will produce more mazes in their L2 because they don't have that same level of exposure to English in both settings. So the way that I carried out my study is I recruited 14 participants. Seven of them reported that they only use Spanish at home. 7 reported that they use both Spanish and English at home. So each of these participants completed 3 tasks. The first was a reading task, reading what is called the grandfather passage, established by Darley et al. In 1975. And basically, this is the passage. It contains diverse English sounds in both normal and an unexpected array of situations. It's pretty complex articulatorily, syntactically, and semantically. And because of that, it's generally seen as an ideal mode of eliciting speech and reading errors. The other piece that the participants completed was a picture description task, which is basically they were presented with an image such as this one, and they were asked to describe it for about 2.5 minutes. So for both of these tasks, participants were allowed to self-correct any errors that they had in their speech, which is, of course, what the mazes are, which is what I was focusing on. So after each of the 14 participants completed each of the 3 tasks, which I recorded, I ended up with 42 language samples, which I transcribed, coded for mazes, and analyzed. So I transcribed each of the language samples on a word processing software, and then went through each of them and coded for the different types of mazes, and then analyzed them later. So the main maze categories that I was focusing on are pauses, repetitions, revisions, connectors, and other mazes which aren't necessarily covered in these other 4, and which I operationally defined later based on what I found. So in order to kind of standardize the process for maze coding, I use these definitions by Fedor, Fiestas, Peña, and Nagy to consistently have the same method, the same standardized method of defining what the mazes were. You can see some examples of what these would look like in an utterance. So here's an example of a language sample that I transcribed and that I coded for mazes. So you'll see the kind of that tongue clip. That is an example of a filled pause. And then in the yellow where it says the mom, that is an example of a sound repetition. So then basically what I did is I transferred these raw scores into this table where I categorized them by maze type and frequency per participant. And after this, I converted the raw scores into percentage scores. So basically dividing the total number of mazes of each type that occurred in the language sample and dividing that by the total number of words in that language sample. So for example, in here, there were 2 filled pauses, and I did not count the number of words in this sample, but it would be 2 out of however many words are in this sample that you can see here. That would be their percentage score. So the percentage score are what I compared between groups. So basically what I found is that overall, first of all, there was less mazing overall in the reading of the grandfather passage versus in the picture description task, which is pretty expected. because in the grandfather passage reading, they had like, the physical text stimulus in front of them. So even though it was like a little bit complex articulatorily for them, they still had that lexical stimulus in front of them that they can refer to. Whereas in the picture description task, they had no form of prompt other than the images that they were shown, and all language had to be produced just innately from their own expressive language. And in both of these tasks, the reading of the grandfather passage and the picture description task, the group who only used Spanish at home produced more mazes than the group who uses both Spanish and English at home, which again aligns with my hypothesis. However, there were a couple of exceptions. In terms of the picture description task, the group who uses both Spanish and English at home, they actually surpass the home language Spanish group in terms of their frequency of use of connectors and interjections of the word like. Not very sure what the reasons for these particular mazes are, but it would be really interesting to follow up with that in a future study. So in conclusion, the evidence of my study suggests that my initial hypothesis, in which those who use both Spanish and English at home would produce fewer mazes than those who use only Spanish at home, was correct. But it wasn't correct 100% of the time, because as we noted, there were a couple of instances in which those who use two languages at home actually produced more mazes than those who only use one language at home, which suggests that mazes are not as straightforward a measuring tool as we had previously thought, because they didn't capture everything that they thought that we thought they would. And along the same token, neither is bilingualism. Bilingualism is not as straightforward as many had previously thought. Within just a single language demographic, the Spanish-English bilingual group, we were able to actually see that depending on their home language, the language that they use at home with their family, they actually produced significantly different results in terms of the quantity and types of mazes that they use. I'd like to close this presentation out with this quote from one of my favorite authors, Julissa Arce, which is basically detailing the very complex reality that it is to be a Spanish-English bilingual speaker, specifically a Latino Spanish-English speaker, and the cultural relevance that these two languages carry within the Latino community. There are a multitude of different reasons as to why Latinos have varying levels of Spanish and English retention. And this relationship between Spanish, English, assimilation, maintenance of your own language and culture, it's a very complex, culturally steeped issue. And I just want everybody watching this presentation to understand that specifically within this demographic, but also with bilingualism as a whole, there are a multitude of different factors that are involved. So I would encourage you to not make blanket statements about bilingual individuals, because as we have seen through this study, the linear and binary societal viewpoint is just simply not representative of the diverse and intersectional reality. This holds true for both society and for the present study. Thank you.